debt that's below this number, we put that money in. So we had a flat, constant debt
Yeah,
payment
but we've been using it for,
Yeah, we've been using it too.
we've been using for operating,
Yep.
supplement the operating budget as well.
To that budget.
It's a good
Yes,
thing we had it.
indirect
I'm
way.
just saying
No,
that,
but
that's what we've been
right.
doing.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
I don't disagree.
Yep.
But it's a good thing that we had it, and we can, and I think we should
But
continue to try.
it is a finite source. I mean, the money that that funded that came from the Berry property.
Right.
Yep.
So, I mean,
It was a
unless and until the other side of that is sold or dealt with, or some other windfall falls on the town, this capital stabilization fund is going to continue to dwindle and,
Well, it may disappear after this
Yeah.
coming budget.
yeah. So I'm not sure the point of what the long-term plan is for the capital stabilization budget.
Well, we're hoping, one, to, with the Economic Development Committee, to get some additional business in, including getting the Gutierrez for the property, the remaining piece that he has a purchase and sale agreement on, a tenant for it, which would give us some additional money. And, depending on how much capital we spend over the next few years, we could get to a point where there's a return. We have a couple of biggies in there that, are, one is the Eisenhower, where we had paid for a lot of that,
Mm-hmm.
just on borrowed money. And that was 5 years, I think. So we do have, was it not?
The total term?
Yeah,
It was a long bond.
it was a long.
Yeah, it was very long term.
Anyway, if you looked at the
Future
debt-
generations will be
if you look
paying
at the
for that.
debt stabilization, the debt payments, what was it, 2014? The end of 2014 is a big drop off. So, can we get there without?
Of course, we may have a school that's going to,
Well,
oh,
that's gonna
that'd be a debt
override,
exclusion though, yeah.
I guess, I don't wanna make a big thing out of it, really. I'm just thinking that what we're doing with the debt capitalization fund and that concept, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think we should try to continue, rather than tie it to the stabilization fund where even if we're putting money in and then, immediately using it for debt, I think we start to get to the point where we're using that money. And I'd not like to use that money unless we have a major disaster.
And
Oh, I
think from
wouldn't
a
I
bond
wouldn't
rating
either.
standpoint, the stabilization fund is looked at differently than this other one that we've established. So this other one gives us a little more flexibility, gives us some target.
Okay. The only thing I would say is that we may not be at this point now, or may not be at this point for another 2 years, or maybe 2 years. But unless there is some sort of a windfall of funds coming into the town, the debt stabilization fund will go away. And I think then we need to operate the stabilization fund as defined here, because that's the idea, is to deal with that, not to diminish the fund, but to be able to deal with debt above a certain level, as you're doing now. So it may be that this will come into play within the next couple of years, that we have to deal with it this way.
Well, if that's the case, then maybe, I still think it should be identified in your policy. What we're doing should be identified in the policy, and if the goal within the policy is to eliminate that, then let's state that and.
It's not a goal to eliminate it. I think it's just I think the
Use the stabilization fund as the funding source, but.
All I'm saying is the reality of the fact is that the debt stabilization fund, as compared to the stabilization fund, has got a finite life. Only because there isn't a source of funding to it, and it's on a downward spiral. It served us well, but it had a slug of money, and when that money's gone,
zero balance in it, so.
Yeah.
Maybe
Yeah,
you,
I can see referencing it maybe in this policy.
We could reference and perhaps that,
That's what-
while
that'll be
while
used
that
first,
is still in place, that's what we're using, but
Then you
this is the
fall
fallback.
back is to the stabilization fund.
well, it always would be anyway. It would be anyway. But I mean, but we've been reluctant to get into the stabilization fund
Right.
because we've established this, although we did have the windfall. We've also added money to it though out of,
See, I actually don't like,
There we have.
I don't like
right, we've added
this
to it.
piece of the policy.
Well, if it's
I
the
don't
fallback,
like the no, I don't like the concept of saying, okay, I don't have a problem putting money into the stabilization fund, don't get me wrong. I don't like the idea of taking money out because our debt number has gone up above some number.
I view this as putting a cap on what you're able to take out, if the need be, if there's a need to go to it.
Well, no, it's, no, the debt would govern, the debt service, the way this is written, the debt service would govern. We'd say that, let's say we pick a number, that the debt service is going to be $1 million. And in a year where the debt service was $1.2 million, then you'd have to take $200,000 out of the stabilization fund to satisfy the deficiency. In a year where the debt service was $800,000, you would put $200,000 into stabilization. That's how this was drafted.
Right, I read it that way. In other words, you're gonna
Yeah.
appropriate $1 million a year regardless, if that's enough, $1 million a year.
And I
in
think,
revenues. And if you have to dip into stabilization to supplement the debt
Right,
service
and-
fund,
and-
but if you're not up to that level, the
You-
balance,
You boost it back into
I think it's
stabilization.
a way of draining the stabilization fund. I have a problem with it.
If you set that target too low, it absolutely is.
and yet you.
You need to budget in the operating budget a reasonable amount of debt service in the operating budget and not rely upon stabilization to satisfy the debt service. So that if you set that bar high enough, then hopefully you're not going to have many cases where you're going to have to dip into it. But I think that's a budget issue that we have to deal with. I mean, you're not going to say, well, we've got the stabilization funds, we're going to set this level at $500,000, knowing downright well that your cost is $1 million in debt service. All you do is look at your debt schedule and know what it is.
No, but
You
I
got
could-
to
I could
budget
look at-
that
I
in
could
the
look at
operating
my
budget.
debt schedule and what I'm gonna have to put out in my FY 213 budget, and say that's the limit. Okay, and therefore, nothing's gonna be touched out of stabilization. And come the next town meeting, we borrow something else because we needed it. New boiler for the little school or the hood school, right? And next thing you know, now the debt number has gone up. And, I mean, this is how we used up the debt stabilization.
That speaks to having a 10-year capital improvement plan. So that you're going to have a boiler. That's probably no surprise given the age of the boiler. Okay, so that's that you could have bet at some point that was going to happen. But if you've got a 10-year plan and it's a good plan, then you know it's going to come up next year and 3 years from now, and with lesser certainty 5 years, and certainly much lesser certainty 10 years from now. So that when you have to bond something and incur the debt service, you're looking at what resources you have to fund it. And that was the item in here when I talked about knowing the funding source. How are you going to do it? Are we going to be able to fund it out of the operating budget? And if we can't fund it out of the operating budget, and it says that we're going to have to hit stabilization 2 years down the road to deal with this, then I think you need to think about that, maybe prioritize items in the 10-year capital plan so that something else that is less critical gets moved out. It's a budgeting process that I think we have to go through. And we should never be surprised by the capital needs. We should be thinking about what those are, with the exception of some disaster befalls us, and we gotta deal with it.
We look at it.
I
mean,
understand
I've
the
seen it-
concept, Don. Okay, it's the reality of the situation. If I look at the capital plan, right, and all of the things
Just
that
gonna
we
say,
need,
and they keep
there's
getting moved.
never enough money in any one given year to do all of
Yeah.
it.
And you gotta make decisions on what can be done and what can't be done based upon what resources you have to pay for it, like any budget.
So then along comes a must be done. You know, which far exceeds anything that we might have had in the capital plan.
Then maybe you look at a capital exclusion for that item, or a debt exclusion for that item. I mean, there are other ways of doing it other than exempt, non-exempt debt. You look at your free cash.
Any
We
other
will,
board
we will
members?
rework this. Do you have timelines for the moving the 25,000 up? I wasn't taking notes unless one of you guys did. And we can incorporate that in, and we'll take,
I'm
and we'll take a
thinking-
look at putting in some recognition of the debt stabilization fund and how that works and
I'm
how.
not exactly sure what a realistic goal is, but I think it's a minimum of a span of 5 years,
Mhm.
probably more like 10. Or maybe every 2 years you move it up by some amount.
Okay.
Maybe you go from 5, 2 years to 10, and 2 years to 15, and 2 more years to 20, and then
Yep.
2 years to
25.
25. And that gets you,
It gives us a starting point to see how we,
Yeah.
see how we do it. We're
Yeah.
gonna review
and
this.
it gives
Yeah.
you something to work to.
Yep.
You say, okay, and it's not something that's so big that, you know,
Never
you
get there.
just give up and you don't do anything about it.
That's right. No, I agree with that.
That's good.
I agree with that. As I say, we recognize that from the get-go, that would be too much to just next year say, we're gonna have to include in the operating budget items between $5,000 and $25,000 that weren't included before. There's no money to pay for
And
them.
as we look out,
Right.
you know, we look at the different departments, and we see what the capital needs are going to be over the next 5 to 10 years. I mean, you can see you need to replace certain equipment, certain things are aging. We look at that, we see it every year, but again, we're so busy stomping out the brush fires, you know, we're unable to budget for it. So, you know, ideally, what you'd like to do is build up your cash reserves to handle the situation when it comes up, based on a timeline schedule. You know, in 3 years, we know we're replacing cruisers, and unmarked cruisers in 5 to 7 years, whatever it is. And then somewhere in the police department budget, there's a reserve account for capital items. But we don't budget that way, you know, and as we, you know, if we have this debt stabilization fund, which we've been able to.
I'm not so sure you can put a reserve fund in an operating budget, though.
No, right,
Yeah.
but what you're asking us to do, and it's not, lay out your 10-year capital plan.
Yeah.
So where do we put the money, and how do we reserve it? You know, 3 years from now, if everything remains static and we can see what's gonna be dropping off, we need to replace, you know, a copier over here and a boiler over there, you know, where's the money gonna be?
That's the whole point of the 10-year plan, and
Well, I
having,
understand that.
and having a funding source for it, so you know where does your debt service,
Getting back to
where
the
does your debt
realistic-
service drop off, and where can you,
I don't disagree, but getting back to the realism of the situation, you know, the revenue sources just aren't there yet. You know,
we're currently paying principal and interest on the non-exempt debt, coming out of the operating budget. There is a debt schedule, okay? As Bob said, it's going to go up more, and then it's going to start tailing off a bit, okay? Using that document, you can look to see where it is you can start replacing cruisers, or replacing boilers, or replacing whatever it is that's on the debt schedule, on the capital improvement schedule, and slot them in to try to deal with the draw on the operating budget for debt service, and satisfy the capital needs. And there's not gonna be a